And now I'd like to, on the second part of this, our theme of the media coverage, I'd like to ask Azadeh and Paula to provide some insights, and I think Narang will have some insights as well. You just touched on it. And maybe also you can give us an overall assessment. I might even ask you to give a pass-fail grade of how the media, especially the European and US media, covered the lead up to the Cup in the stories and coverage about concerns about migration and labor rights, related questions about Qatar's ability and suitability to host the Cup, as a country, as a place, and the way it's situated in the region, and then the coverage of the competition itself as it unfolded. And I think the wider lens here is the criticism of the Orientalist coverage, but also the double standards compared, for example, to past coverage of Russia and China hosting both the World Cup and Olympics. And then also versus how US and Western media might frame critiques of the GCC states and any repressive state in the global South. So Azadeh, if you want to go first, and then Paula, and then Narang on that question.
Thank you. I think this is actually a great question that would sort of take some of the things that Aryan just highlighted, that many of the states in the region are implicated, and this question of shared accountability for the ethical concerns and the various sort of very correct criticism levels at Qatar that are shared. So I guess that feeling of the need for that accountability to course through the media coverage, especially in the region itself, and sort of the indignation within the region at that not happening, that the abuses in Qatar, that all of the problems around human rights in Qatar have been covered by the media, especially the Western media, as a uniquely Qatari problem, one in which Western governments and contractors and financial institutes that go in and out of the Gulf and have headquarters based there. And so it is a very exceptional and Qatari failing. I guess in terms of the broad media coverage, I guess just to take a quick step back, I think it has overall the tenor of the coverage, whether on broadcast or television or in print, has been that the hosting of the games in Qatar is some sort of global human rights tragedy, that it is regrettable that Qatar should not have been awarded the games, and that it is an occasion for distress and hand-wringing, and it is a shame. More so than any other time in the past, of course, at all the moments when the games have been hosted in countries that are, Russia hosted while it was occupying Crimea. China hosted the Winter Olympics as the ongoing abuses in Xinjiang were underway. So the perception, certainly in the Middle East, amongst sort of Arab publics who are active on social media, and as we can glean their sentiments, is not that the criticism is unfair. Of course, the criticism is fair, and it's been part of the whole story of the last decade that's passed since Qatar was awarded the games and tried to start making some steps towards improving some of these things. So not taking any umbrage at criticism, but the double standards, or hypocrisy. I mean, those terms are used interchangeably in social media when columnists, ordinary people who were just tweeting and sharing their views raise this. That Qatar is uniquely and particularly targeted for multiple reasons. So firstly, yes, that there was no such shrill critique of these other countries, and that the treatment of Qatar and the portrayal in the media of its hosting of the games as a sort of global embarrassment was very much sort of tied to, and I think we have to, acknowledge that there is after effects, I think, of a sense that the Western media, especially since the Arab Spring and the Arab Spring uprisings, treated the region and the problems in the region and the wars in the region and the religious aspects of wars in the region as a very exceptional problem, that Muslim political violence was exceptional, it was irrational, it was a different type of violence than any other kind of conflict in the world, and that when it happened in the region and amongst Muslim majority countries, it was somehow qualitatively more evil and unfathomable. So I think that the whole history of the war on terror and the exceptionalization of that kind of militancy and terrorism is like the baggage that publics bring to the media treatment of Qatar. So I think that's sort of one aspect of it that kind of lurks, but I think it's in the background. And then sort of on the double standards, it's not simply, I think, double standards, sort of Muslim world versus the rest of the world, but also within the countries of the Arabian Peninsula. This sense that Qatar is particularly targeted because of its foreign policy ambitions, the way that it's tried to differentiate itself in the region as the sort of backer of the Arab Spring uprisings, and ended up sort of finding itself in opposition to other partners in the Gulf that are more certainly that have been more closely aligned with recent Western security and foreign policy goals in the region. So that even within the GCC or the Arabian Peninsula, or however we wish to call it, that Qatar is particularly targeted in ways for this kind of criticism and media abuse, as it's perceived, in ways that, for example, Saudi is not. Saudi hosts Davos in the desert, it hosts pop stars, and Mariah Carey goes there, and influencer parties are there, even though it operates the exact same kafala system, that it has a history of very ugly mass expulsions of different migrant workers, or mass expulsions of Ethiopians, that Saudi, when it tries to project itself, its soft power on the world stage in the same way, does not come under the same sort of targeting that Qatar has. So I think that's the sort of wide range of the kind of perceptions around the media coverage from within the region. And just the last thing I'll mention on this, within the kind of selective application of this kind of media focused countries in the region is, Tony Blair recently said that Qatar should be spared this kind of treatment, or that it should be treated with more respect because of its investments in the UK. And Qatar took great umbrage of this, because they said, our culture should be respected because everyone's culture should be respected. You shouldn't be able to buy respect from the British because you invested in the Shard and in Harrods. So that was a sort of such an explicit kind of linking of economic policy and sort of geopolitics to who deserves respect. And I think that's very much reflected as well in the tenor of the media coverage.
Thank you. Paul?
I think that was such a thorough and persuasive answer as of that. I'm not sure what I really have to add, and I agree with everything you said. I think, my own research doesn't work on media representations in the Arab world, or of the Arab world, but I don't think you have to do research in it. You just have to live in this country to know, right? The legacy of Orientalist coverage of the region, and in some sense of the third world in general. So how many World Cups have there been in the Global South? And what kind of coverage has there been of these kinds of sporting events? I mean, China aside, I certainly remember lots of questions being raised about the way that coverage of the South African World Cup also raised problematic, right, questions. So I think there are issues around long Orientalist histories and colonial histories of representation that inflect, the way institutional media, legacy media cover, despite the best intentions of individual journalists, right? Just the kind of structuring of these narratives, even when they show, and so this is, for me, this is like a real puzzle, because it's, I'm invested in working on migrant labor justice for South Asian workers in the Gulf, and work for a university that itself has exploited migrant workers in building of its campus in Abu Dhabi. But in raising these questions, right, despite your best intentions, you are funneled into this discursive into the discursive parameters that have in some ways overdetermined what you can and can't say, right? So in some ways, I think there's, we're in a moment where there's some complexity. So for example, I don't know how many of you read the New Yorker article on the World Cup. You know, that piece, for example, was heavily framed by Natasha's book. And so in that piece, you had the kind of argument that what the World Cup in Qatar allows us to do is really distill the problems at hand that are global and structural. And I think that's the message, right? But that's a very long New Yorker article. That's not the message that is being read in the sort of mainstream media coverage and social media clips. So I think I struggle with the double standards and hypocrisy question, because I just feel that social media funnels that, so everything is, so you can't ever make a critique because everything becomes double standard. So, you're always in this, you can't have any kind of debate and move forward in terms of a progressive agenda because you're always calling each other out, right? And that, again, is because of the algorithmic logic of the social media companies, and so it's difficult. I think it's difficult for all the reasons that you raised. I would say though that, there's something, I think this is going to come in, Mohammed, your next question, I believe, but I think there's something to be said about thinking about the differences between the institutional media actors and the ways in which they set certain parameters of how things are covered. And the way in which the people represent these issues. So, I think about the Palestinian flag, being shown, and it's not just in the Arab world, but it's something that circulates across the global South, for example, and in terms of the global South in the global North, right? And so there's a way in which you have a kind of post-national people's solidarity, and that could be wistful thinking for some of us, but I feel like that is a very different narrative, right, of the Cup in Qatar than this other, human rights. It should never have been there, so, and it's less organized and more spontaneous, so I mean, but it's also being mediatized, right? It's a very mediatized phenomenon. So there, I think you can have both of those things happening at the same time. But yeah, I think that those Orientalist frames that you bring up are powerful and very difficult to overcome, even with the best of intentions. And the points you made about Qatar, I found very interesting. My own family actually my parents lived in Qatar for 10 years in the 1990s. And I, as a middle-class South Asian person, I have very fond memories of Qatar, and the souk. And it's just interesting to think about. So yeah, I feel both. I feel the anger of this misrepresentation and double standards, but I also want to raise these issues around labor rights and human rights justice. And so I think and walking that and thinking transnationally is really the only way forward. And we can't just give up, right? And just say, any kind of criticism is Orientalism, right? Which I do think happens. So I think that's something that we need to think about.
Thank you. Any on the double standards?
No, I think the panelists did such a wonderful job. And this is a little niche kind of comment. I will confess, I'm actually a football fanatic, not just once every 4 years, unfortunately. So I follow certain football journalists very, very closely, and it's been interesting to see how they've really, some of them have learned a lot in this past year, because I think some of the good ones associated, for instance, with the Guardian newspaper, they were definitely traipsing into the kind of Orientalist tropes about the Qataris are incapable of organizing such an event, how they're going to build all these things, the inabilities, kind of almost like in the 19th century British colonial records and stuff. But over time, they changed, and what was interesting is that many of them very quickly, or in the last few weeks, really realized that, look, the problems that we are calling Qatar on are really the problems of FIFA. And maybe in my next question, I'll say something, next question, I'll pick this up. But I think that's the other thing that's, remember, when we talk about the World Cup or the Olympics, while there is the host country, you have to also learn there are organizations that are incredibly powerful, that are basically oligopolies, a small select, mostly men from around the world that control and manage and decide where these events take place. So the sports journalists, partly because they were following the corruption in FIFA, I think actually they did a nicer job disentangling the critique of Qatar or maintaining the critique of Qatar, but also connecting it to, if you will, the institutions of the global economy and so forth. So I would find it more useful to actually read their commentary. And also because they've spent the last 4 weeks in Doha, and their awareness, like the number of times over the last 2 weeks on Twitter, they've made comments that this is the most global South World Cup ever, because as you know, the visas were relaxed. So people from literally all over the global South were able to go to Doha, and the actual atmosphere has changed. So if you recall, the very first day of the World Cup, the big news item was no beer in the stadiums. And this was like, oh, this is a tragic. But now people have commented, well, okay, it may not be great for some, but there are all of these other things, and the visa restrictions have actually transformed the way that football fans have been interacting with one another across large distances, and people in the global South are meeting. Now, I'm not talking about, this is not another Bandung moment or anything like that. I don't want to exaggerate it, but there is something to be said about that. Not all World Cups have to be the same.
Right.
Okay, thank you. You keep the mic around because the next question is to you. Sort of the question, partly the live wire question of our event and partially the need of our extra security, which is the how, why, and with what consequences do you think Iran's participation in this World Cup was politicized, and then especially in comparison to Iran's participation in previous Cups, and what this might tell us about the current protest movement both inside Iran and outside?
Okay, that's a good question. I suspect for some people in the audience, that's a very important question for tonight's event. If you can give me a moment to step back, partly because I am an old man, my first memories as a human being were from the 1978 World Cup. The first World Cup I really remember is 1982, which is the best World Cup that ever took place. But that's a debate for drinks. But my first memories go back to watching the 1978 World Cup. I'm saying that not just to age myself, but because there are actually a couple of threads one can pick up there. One is some very good journalists have pointed out that was the first modern World Cup that we know. It was the first World Cup that Coca-Cola, Adidas, Kodak, these huge commercial multinational companies invested in. It's when FIFA realized we can make money, and we can make lots of money out of this once every 4-year events. So when we look at the history of the World Cup going back to 1930, there's a real turning point in the mid-1970s with how FIFA was run and the scale of revenue that it could generate. It could just make selling exclusive rights to TVs, to Coca-Cola and so forth. So 78 is marked as this turning point. It's different from the previous World Cups. Second, it is, yes, we have the World Cup in 1934 headed by Mussolini. We have the Olympics headed by Hitler. We have these other major sports washing events. But 1978 is important because it was clearly an event organized by the Argentinian generals to whitewash their coup and their slaughter of thousands of Argentinians. Right? They hired a New York City PR firm to help them in this campaign. And in many respects, they did a great job. Argentina won the World Cup. Inshallah, Argentina will win the World Cup this on Sunday. Cards are on the table. But they handle it. Now, this is despite.
So much for third world Saudi.
Well, I have my limits. But this is despite, I should say, we forget about this. Amnesty International organized a campaign called Yes to Football, No to Torture in 1978. But they were trying to get soccer players to not attend the World Cup. They failed. There's one very famous German player, Maoist, who actually did not participate. He was the only one. Pizza, I can talk about later. but they've largely failed. But that was an important thing. But the third part about 1978 that is important to go back to really get to Mohammed's question, it was the first time that Iran made it to the World Cup. This was in the middle of the Iranian Revolution, the summer of 1978. The revolution, by all the way we usually date it, is in the fall of 1978 and is victorious in the winter of 1979. So it falls right smack in 1978. Members of that soccer team were members of political parties, underground groups. They were politicized. There were numerous rumors that leftists, for instance, was left out of the team. The coach was removed. It was controlled by the monarchy, and the court refused certain things. So there's interference. But as far as we know, there was no attempt by the Iranians who were in the midst of a revolution to call on Iranians to not support the team or to ban the team or anything like that. This brings me to the question of politicization, because things are very different from 1978, but also from 1998. Some of you are old enough to remember 1998, Iran makes it to the World Cup for the second time. This is the famous game against the US in 1998. It's the World Cup in France. In 1998, when Iran makes it into the World Cup by defeating Australia, there were spontaneous mass celebrations, truly spontaneous expressions of joy all across Iran, in Tehran, by all different men, women, young, in the streets for hours on end, all night long. So that was and many people connect it to the reformist movement and reformist era. There was a real kind of a public shift in Iran. Now, if we speed up to the contemporary, the current World Cup, part of the issue, the question of why was this World Cup with the Iranian soccer team, the team mainly politicized? Well, the government, the Islamic Republic, has systematically politicized sports for their own benefit. These were teams, performance by men and women, interestingly, were always examples for the regime of how well the revolution is doing, how well the Iranian nation is doing, how well it's progressing, how many medals it wins at the Olympics, and so on and so forth. So the regime is definitely part of that politicization. But what we saw this past 3 months, was a concerted campaign by certain groups that I don't fully know who was involved, who pushed for basically expelling the team. And once they failed to expel the team from the World Cup, the push was to make the argument that this team doesn't represent the Iranian nation, it represents the Islamic Republic. And if you support this team, therefore you are implicitly or explicitly supporters of the Islamic Republic, i.e. they deeply polarize football, right? As it should be clear, football is political, but to polarize it and politicize it in this fashion, in my view, was short-sighted and unproductive, right? If the goal was to mobilize people in support of a protest movement to change the Islamic Republic, something that I think many Iranians are supportive of, what all scholars of revolution or protest will tell you is that what you need to do is, in a sense, create a big tent or a coalition of forces for that effort. As we know, many people support protests, but they were not willing to risk their lives and go into the street. All of us in the stream were Iranian. We are continuously in touch with friends and family in Iran who support what these young men and women have been doing in the streets for the past 3 months. But they're petrified for themselves, for their high school kids, for their college kids, and in a sense, what in Persian we call the gray sector of society. So rather than reaching out to this gray sector, which I would include those 26 soccer players, and trying to encourage them to support this movement, well, instead what happened, I would say, is this politicization through moral outrage. That you're either for the protest or you're against it. You're either supporting the Islamic Republic or you're not. And at the end of the day, there's a real limit to moral outrage. There are outrageous things happening in Iran for many years, but including these past 3 months. It's outrageous that children have been killed, are on trial, or in prison. It's outrageous. But to actually engage in political action, you need organization, you need planning, you need to move beyond short-sighted strategies, right? And unfortunately, what we saw on display, and we can pick it up in the Q&A if people want, what we saw happening the last few months around this question of the Iran soccer team and the World Cup was an attempt to just create a polarized sphere, which in many ways, ultimately, those players failed. As we saw, the pressure on them was enormous. I think the Islamic Republic came off very badly, and they spent lots of money to send paid fans from Iran to Qatar. So the the Islamic Republic did do well, but the cause and the movement for profound, dramatic political and democratic change in Iran didn't actually lost an opportunity in many ways.
I'm gonna save one of the questions, broader theme questions for the Q&A. So I'll end with this one, which is a two-part question. So just so that we have enough time in the Q&A, and if you don't have enough questions, we'll come back to these themes. And this question is for Azadeh, and I think Paula, you touched on this a little bit a while ago. And that's your assessment of the social media and public response within the Arab world on two levels to the Cup. First, in response to the early Western media coverage and critiques, for example, BBC boycotting the opening ceremonies, and then later the response to Morocco's success in the tournament. And Ryan might want to weigh in on this too, even if you're partisan way. And a related question, sort of touching on your comment earlier, Paula, the Moroccan team and the way, and their fans and the ways they've centered support for Palestine at every game. And so just, I'd like to hear your assessment of that, and also what the latter part, the centering of Palestine in the games, Morocco, but others in Tunis as well, when they were in contention. What this might tell us about the gap between popular sentiment in the Arab world, especially in countries whose governments have pursued normalization with Israel. As I want to take the first part about, well, any parts to that you'd like.
Sure. Also, I think that Brian should have a politics and football.
Yes.
Super engaging.
Sure.
Well, there's something there. So maybe I'll talk in some of the themes from the last question into this one, because I think it can set it up in terms of the media and public response in the Arab world. I think Qatar did a quite skillful job in positioning the games, the Cup, as a regional World Cup. It projected a generosity of its hosting to include the Arab world, the Middle East. It very much positioned it as a regional cup that it was hosting, that it was organizing on behalf of the region. There was a lot of effort put into setting up shuttle flights from other GCC countries, making sure that fans from within the Arab world, specifically North Africa, could attend, organizing their attendance. So I think that sort of set up a pretty receptive public mood, certainly, and amongst the fans, to sort of have what ended up, I think, being a quite extraordinary rekindling of, for want of a better term, Arab public sentiment. Or that, there were certainly people on social media, so joyous, and the notion of Arab nationalism, the notion of Arab pride was said to be gone. It was said to have died out. It didn't exist anymore in the 21st century. But look, we have it back. The euphoria, and even the Saudi Arabia is usually an especially popular country within the Middle East in terms of Arab publics, but that was widely celebrated. And then also this kind of unscripted unfolding, but very much sort of chronicled by people on their mobile phones, interactions between Israeli journalists and Arab fans. And I think that was consumed voraciously online and amongst publics, because of how few opportunities there are for that simply to happen, to have Israelis and Arabs at a major event, having the occasion to interact and ask questions, and to sort of put to the test whether the sort of purported underpinnings of the Abraham Accords, the idea that Arab publics, or specifically the publics of the countries that have signed those agreements, are ready for that kind of cultural normalization of ties. So those kinds of scenes, I think, were perhaps you read the articles about it. Israeli journalists trying to interview different fans, and like having all these interactions about, well, we support Palestine, or where are you from? that's two countries, or that's, even just contesting, the origin of, Israel as an existing place, separate from, two countries. So all of that, I think, was quite extraordinary. I mean, I don't think we've had any moment in recent years where a sense of sort of collective Arab pride, and I guess it sounds quite sort of sweeping, but that was a language that was being used online. That was, I think, the sort of mood and the sentiment, certainly, online, and extended by the Moroccan game, the Moroccan win, which I think I'll turn it over to you, Paula, because this question of Palestine then was so advanced, extended by the Moroccan team.
I'll answer this briefly because I want more of Orang's World Cup podcast. Also, I'm not really a football fan, except for the fact that I'm married to a Brazilian, and so therefore, football morning in our household. But as I said, yeah, he walked. We switched allegiances though to Morocco. So I mean, I guess I would on the media question. It was interesting, Orang, when you were talking about moral outrage in the discussion on the Iran team. I mean, I think what we see with both the Palestine pan-Arab third worldist internationalism, right? I mean, I like to think of it, Fred Moten, the cultural theorist here at NYU, who you might know, he talks about this kind of, can we have an internationalism outside of the idiom of the nation state? And you see that actually happening organically at this moment, with the kind of pan-Arab, pan-African third worldist coming together around Palestine, but also in support of the Moroccan team, et cetera. So that's the good part of social media, right? That's the sort of possibility of creating this mediatized publics from below. So that's one part of it. And the other part is the moral outrage, right? And the moral outrage is, and that's a kind of limitation of the institutional politics, right? In that sense that both with the workers' question, and I mean, I know the content, I'm only following the Iran case. I don't know the ins and outs as well as both of you do. But in a sense, moral outrage is very easy on social media, right? It is the mode of social media. And this kind of virtue signaling around kind of simple issues leading to moral outrage constrains the debate. And that's the same thing with, players in solidarity with third world workers or queer rights, expressing moral outrage, but not connecting that moral outrage to any kind of action or actual solidarity with, for example, on the workers' issues, unions or workers themselves, or thinking about how these issues around temporary migration manifest in the countries they come from, right? And so the connection, the limitation of a social mediated politics that begins and ends with moral outrage is, I think, what we're seeing in both, what ties both of these cases together. But it's not so simple, right? It's not, we can't have dystopian understandings of these technologies because on the other side, you have this internationalism that is coming from below. Both of those things are happening through these mediated technologies, so it's a complicated picture. So yeah, I would just say that. And the other thing I think that is interesting is that in the American media coverage that I have followed, it seems to me the focus has been on Morocco being the first African country, which is which is true, North African country, but there's almost not a language to talk about pan-Arab, solidarity. I mean, the Moroccan player and his mother dancing, to me, that image, that video, that disrupts so much of the way in which Arab masculinity and that completely undermined it, in a minute. I mean, I feel like as a media studies professor, I'm like, great, I'm gonna use, you're gonna use that image to teach. But in some ways, those images are in advance of a kind of discourse, right? I don't think the American institutional media has a language to talk about that, so that's a kind of interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, no, the image of the Moroccan players dancing with their mothers, kissing their mothers, I
Yeah.
think is what there's almost a silence around it because
Right.
the mainstream media didn't know what to do that
They don't
because
know what to say.
first of all,
Yeah.
the fact that Arab men could love their mothers is just beyond their imagination. But that was and it was
And
really
the Arab
touching.
mothers can dance.
And Arab mothers can dance, and Arab mothers would be at a stadium, right,
Right,
and
right.
supporting their sons.
Yeah.
And he took off his shirt,
Right.
and there's this kind of strange, interesting masculinity. He takes off his shirt, so you see him with his muscles. He gives
Right.
his shirt to his mother, so
Right.
that was very interesting. Viking. And I can't comment on the media issue, but on the moral outrage, one of the moments that stuck with me is, if you recall, I think it was the second day of the tournament. This was there was this important game between England and Iran, and there was this moment of actual real tension. If you recall, in that game, the Iranian players clearly collectively decided we're not going to sing the national anthem, so they stood there stoically as a form of dissent. Right now, a lot of Iranians on social media said that wasn't enough. They should have done more. They should have. I don't know what they imagined soccer players to do. I don't know why we have such high expectations of soccer players, but okay. But they weren't happy. But if you recall, all the media were struck by this. That now, in the context where the Islamic Republic is executing or killing and arresting Iranians on the street, these players did this. But if you recall, at that game, the captain of the English team, as well as many other European teams, had declared they would wear an armband, a kind of a rainbow armband in solidarity with LGBT rights. That FIFA explicitly said that was not allowed. And if you recall, all of the captains caved. Not a single captain actually wore that once FIFA warned them. And this juxtaposition of these 11 Iranian players not singing the anthem, and everyone knew they were going to pay a price, right? Everyone knew that the hotel was full of secret police and so on and so forth. While these captains who live in free democracies, weren't willing to risk showing solidarity with LGBT communities back in Europe or in the Middle East or in Qatar, right? Was quite striking. And I wish there wasn't enough media coverage on that juxtaposition, but on the Twitter world that I'm part of, which is, I'm sure, a very boring, exclusive one, there was people noted, but I think a lot more could have done with that.
Thank you. We've started about 7 or 8 very interesting threads. We can keep going. We have some time left. I'd like to open it to all of you. I'm sure you have questions. We have about 20-25 minutes left. So I'd like to take as many questions as we can. You have an audience mic, or you can just project actually. Raise your hand and project. I'll call on you. Yes.
Hi. Thank you very much for this panel. Very informative on all different aspects of the World Cup as we're watching it unfold. First World Cup in the Middle East. Ryan, you brought up a lot of very interesting points. I'm Iranian American, so I was attentively paying attention to a lot of the movements, like a lot of us. To your last point about the captains not wearing the LGBT band, I think the difference between the team, Iranian team choosing not to sing has no repercussions from FIFA. So I don't think it's a fair comparison because FIFA would not regulate or sanction or do anything if you don't sing your national anthem. So, but you could be disqualified for a match if you don't wear the LGBTQ, or if you wear the LGBTQ band. So I think that's why a lot of media didn't focus on it, because it's kind of a moot point. But it was a remarkable act for the team to take action and, put their heads down and wear the black bands before the game. That is commendable. I just had a question about what you think a successful, to go back to your the team that wanted, or the group that wanted the players, the Iranian players to not, or to politicize themselves. Why do you think this was short-sighted and unsuccessful? Because would it have been better if no one had said anything and the players would have been politicized by IR, Islamic Republic, and there was no backlash from any group of athletes that were the main people that were like, well, we should not support the Iranian players?
I'll make a comment, but maybe others would like also to add comments. On the armband issue, I mean, I understand, but let's just face it, Harry Kane getting a yellow card for wearing that armband versus these players' parents maybe being taken into questioning in Iran. I don't know which one, I mean, which is worse. I know you may love Harry Kane and, and all that, but I mean, the punishment for wearing an armband versus upsetting the Secret Service in Iran is quite different. So I don't know. Maybe we should all be as fearful of FIFA. But so that was my point there on that point. On what else could have been done? I mean, what I found to elaborate. I mean, look, it's clear that these players were politicized. They were posting things on social media. There's a certain lack of trust. So these are young men who were born in Iran in most cases, nearly all cases, were raised there. Let them articulate their politics instead of basically forcing them to choose a specific form of political action, right? They were already posting. Some of Iran's best soccer stars have been integral to this movement. Some of them have been thrown into prison, former soccer players, right? So it's not like these are apolitical beings. They're Iranians. Post-revolutionary Iranians, by definition, are political, right? So why don't you actually trust them and give them an opportunity to articulate their own politics? Politics is not black and white. There's a lot of gray area. Let them. And what I was impressed by them not singing was that it was clearly a collective decision. I'm sure there was some of those players who wanted to sing or are afraid, but they clearly somehow decided as a group that we're going to create a circle. If you want, they knelt in a circle, and so that was a collective decision. Politics is collective. It's not individual sitting there behind your computer in your underwear tweeting out into the oblivion. It is about relating to other people. Let these players do that.
But they weren't allowed to because the Islamic Republic had people pulling them away.
But they did. But
He's saying that he's giving the example of that act about the anthem being that political act.
Yeah, but I mean, they did. But more fundamentally, look, I mean, all of these things take up time and energy and effort. So instead of putting your energy and effort into politicizing the soccer team, there are people in Iran getting thrown into prison, languishing. And what I saw for those 2 weeks is that the Twitter sphere just talked about these 26 men instead of what was happening in Iran. It disappeared from social media almost. It was almost as if Iran didn't exist, and only Doha existed. And what was happening in the stadium. I thought it was, just, naive and foolhardy. And look, I love football. I think it's deeply political. That's why I told you about 1978. It's important. That's why my 11-year-old son knows about 1978. They were torturing people right next to the stadium in Argentina. But there are some moments where football is not important. What these Iranian players were doing was not important. What the Iranian people were doing on the streets of Tehran, in the villages and towns in Iran is what's important. You're politicizing something that should not be politicized. There are more important things in the world. I will absolutely watch. I watch almost every soccer game because it's important to me, but it's not the most important thing in the world. It doesn't matter. So why are these people in Toronto and DC telling me that it's important what these soccer players do? I think it's back. Sorry if I.
Does anyone want to add?
As a non-Iranian person, I think one thing that's interesting here is, I don't know you as a big, but I think we're all diasporic, people, and I think there's something here about the politics of moral outrage amongst the diaspora. in relation to what's happening in the places in question. And so here, I think about India, in which there's a kind of line sometimes being drawn about a radical act or a petition that you can sign that, people in India who are radical don't have the luxury of signing or don't have the, so I think that, we live in a time, Iran is a different, we live in a time where many of the places we come from are facing these kinds of constraints on speech, on action, on politics, where religious minorities are being targeted. And for us to take the most radical positions and then be morally pure about it here, I think it really, I think we are now doing the politics of the armband, because we are taking morally pure position, but we don't have to pay the cost. So paying the cost is really crucial. And I think we have to remember that. People are paying the cost. And that's politics. It's collective, but it's also that there's material repercussions for the things we sign and the things we do. And so, yeah, I wanted to say that from the Indian context because that really resonated. It's not just Iran. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, other questions? Yes. Yeah. You want to stand up just so we can hear you?
I have a question about like also in solidarity the World Cup and like the World Cup as a site for the public sentiment and first referendum on a lot of these like normalization deals. And I'm thinking how at first a lot of solidarity came around very naturally. I didn't see it being forced by one side or the other. It's very much a natural. I know one of you mentioned about the Israeli channel interviews and it's really good to see how the Iranian fans or all the North African fans or even I saw a video about the Japanese fans and the Argentinian fans how they were refusing to talk to them. So my question was more in the sense of do you think this kind of very strong public sentiment against normalizing inside of Israel, do you think how is it going to affect future, is it going to move it in put stop on this, or is it going to continue at the same pace? Because at the same time, it's interesting that Morocco is almost inshallah in the final, winning, and they have the coldest side of Israel right now with the military ties and the drone factories. But at the same time, there's an even further right-wing government in Israel. I think it's going to push these normalization deals on on the back burner for a while, or it's not going to have any effect at all because people, the leaders don't really care about the public sentiment that much anyway. That's what it's trying to do.
Who wants to? You all have something. Do you want to take it part?
Yeah, you should answer that.
Okay. I'd like to think it would have some impact, but based on recent history, it doesn't, and especially, I guess, especially the regional history since 2011, in that the regimes in the region have generally diverged from popular will. Even more than there have been other historical periods where they've diverged quite a bit, but in moving past and no longer even paying lip service to Palestine as a cause, to Palestinian solidarity, and it's heartening. I think it's heartening for anyone who follows news in the region and seeing the images and seeing the popular will shift in this way, and to see that it's not, despite the efforts of governments in the region, despite the efforts and huge sums of money paid by Qatar's frenemies, let's say at this point, and the investment they've made in sort of moving the region away and moving popular will away from sympathy for Palestine. I would hope in some small way MBS is listening to this and watching, and think he must be. He probably thinks he can impose his will on anyone, but waiting for the death of his father and he kind of takes the steps toward normalization. But maybe that's one. It might give him, well, maybe, or probably sort of, what am I saying? So sort of contradicting everything written about MBS, but it sort of probably just gives them a little extra leverage for what he can get out of normalization. So it's not a very, I guess it's not a very encouraging picture, but you know, at some point, thinking through the long term and thinking through the potential decades ahead of us, it's the one encouraging part I would say, and I think most of you would agree with this, is that seeing that sense of, and as you said, it's not orchestrated solidarity, is encouraging, and you know, people want to express this, and you know, despite what their governments want them to do or want them to say.
I might only just add to that, is that, you know, one hope that, or possibility that could emerge from seeing these scenes and the flags and the interactions between the journalists and this sort of unscripted, almost sort of reality TV show World Cup reaction to normalization, is perhaps some curiosity within European media, American institutional legacy media around actual Arab public sentiment. I think there's virtually no reporting on that. And that's really a major gap, because you know, there's of course the policy reporting on the Abraham Accords, but there is, and of course, you know, within the countries that normalized, there's no media coverage of resistance or dislike or resentment of those steps. So perhaps it will simply, you know, trigger that.
And it's hard to hide the flag on the field after every.
To hide, and there was something sort of startling about seeing, you know, the kind of politics from below that perhaps we're all used to seeing in sort of niche areas of our lives. They're not reflected on anything like a FIFA televised game, break out into the mainstream sort of global like image rotation. And you know, these were themes that really North Africa, I think, in particular, on the question of Palestine, and this sort of certainly came out in Tunisia during the uprising, and this was a theme that was threaded through the aspirations of young people in the Arab uprisings. And part of the story of you know, the whole Gulf GCC rift was Qatar's support for those uprisings, and moving very much against the Emirati position, which was to shut down and oppose any Islamist-infused activism or movement or opposition to these old autocracies. So that's an old story, but it's part of why, I mean, it's the sort of backstory to the Abraham Accords, it's the backstory to the GCC conflict and the resentment towards Qatar and Al Jazeera's role in supporting those uprisings. So it was a sort of moment where, you know, that whole period where, you know, the uprisings country to country failed, the media moved on, the Abraham Accords are a reality, like actual reality, kind of imposed itself for some seconds in time. So perhaps, you know, this is the reminder of that. You know, hopefully we'll break into some actual media coverage of what it means when you have a foreign policy that is purely sort of led from the top and opposed from the bottom.
Thank you. We have a couple of minutes left. And yes, I want to see how many questions. Okay, 3. We might be able to go.
Do you want to take
Let's
all
take-
of them?
let's take them. Let's
Take
collect.
all of them
Yes,
together.
let's collect them. Ali first, and then we'll make our way back. Ali, go ahead.
Thank you, thank you everyone for this beautiful panel. It's really enjoyable. I just wanted to add something to answer before I start, which is the coverage. There's actually coverage in the German media about the Palestine issue coming up in the. It was a bit critical, but it was there. My question is, I mean, you all touched on Orientalism and, you know, the colonial approach, and but I don't know if the language barrier was actually, maybe it's unfair to ask you about this, but the Arabic coverage of Al Jazeera Arabic, not English, has responded to all the criticism in the Western media by, this is actually my question, is that the number of workers who died is actually 3. So now we have the Guardian saying 6,500 and we have 3. So based on your work, this is my question, and I'll just say something really quickly. So where do we stand actually between 3 and 6,500? That's the gap. One comment which I would also like to, check inside about it is that there is another factor that Al Jazeera has played to sort of introduce to the coverage, which is religion. Now we're talking about
And you're talking about Arabic specifically, right?
Arabic,
Yes.
yes, but they don't. I mean, it's
It doesn't, yeah.
there's that whole different monster here. So, it was religion. It was us, the pure Muslims, versus the promiscuous West. Referring, of course, to the LGBT issue, it was another attack from the West on Muslims. So, in order to avoid the question of this question about whether it's 3 or 6,500, the answer was to start to, emotions, religious emotions are always the best answer, and of course, conspiracy theory,
Right.
and everyone is conspiring against us. So I was just wondering if you have any intake about introducing religion, because as Aaron said, it's heavily politicized, but now it's even religious. So which I don't think Christianity was involved in any World Cup. I mean, Argentina and others, it was a political issue, human rights issue, but no one was talking about any religion, whether it's China or
Something actually showed up in the Crusader, who gave the interview in the Crusader uniform. But there's a, but I see your, I think I see your point, and I think you're, yes, let's take the next, thank you, Ali, the next question, right in the row behind you.
Sure.
Please, if you can stand up, yes, so we can all.
Hi, my name's Zaina, and I'm both a journalist and study Middle Eastern studies, so this is like basically my two worlds. And basically my question is, if you could say maybe 3 or 4 main takeaways for journalists, which I know obviously is very hard as academics to do, looking forward, basically how we should think of like practically decolonizing journalism when it comes to coverage of the Middle East and North Africa. Like, for example, like I could think of examples myself, which means like things like increasing coverage by hiring more local reporters from the region, for example, places that allow it. Increasing coverage of academics from the region, not like a white person from DC who doesn't understand the like true language barriers, doesn't understand the like real nuances. And decolonizing in that sense, like are there other examples of things that maybe as a journalist you could be more wary of looking forward to cover?
Thank you. We'll have that one as well. And the last question, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lola, and I was wondering, what do you suspect the media coverage will be like if once Morocco wins? What do you hear?
Okay, so what will projections for the coverage on Sunday? Oh, Jared, you have a question.
I just, if I can tag one more thing on, I think this is for our 2030. What does a Saudi, Egyptian, Greek consortium be? What does that mean?
You want to start with that? We can
Process.
Do you want to take Ali's question first about the kind of
the
the religious, using kind of religious rhetoric, which is an old trick of Al Jazeera's, and I were talking about this last week, especially like the Iraq War, the AMEJA Shadi, and so the sort of rhetoric of Al Jazeera has a long history of that religious modification and to change the subject basically.
Right.
And I think Paula actually take this one, especially because of the both elements, and also, and I guess there's the issue of the 6,500 figure from
right.
from the Guardian is problematic because it's
Right. Yeah.
the context.
Yeah.
Microphone.
Oh, right, microphone. Okay. So I mean, I'm not going to give a figure, but I would say it's somewhere between 3 and 6,500. And I think all sorts of organizations have documented that. So I mean, we'd have to look and see. Migrant Rights, which is like Migrant-Rights, has documented migrant labor abuse and deaths, et cetera, very, very carefully. That would be a site to look and see. But, to me, the question is both Western coverage and it sounds like, I follow Al Jazeera English, I don't speak Arabic, but, the focus on death and migrant death is the problem for me, which is, of course, this is an important issue, but by foregrounding death, you don't talk about the living people who will also, by the way, be there after the 18th, because Qatar is growing and expanding. And, so I think that in both cases, the kind of denialism through religion or this kind of paternalism, this paternalistic coverage of Western media in the kind of framing of the sort of exceptional nature of migrant labor exploitation, tend to represent the workers themselves as passive victims. And so I think what's really important in terms of decolonizing media for the global South and for racialized communities everywhere is it's not just about representation by people from X nationality, but representation and institutional accountability by racialized working class communities who are often at the margins of any kind of media debate. And so I think that is crucial. And I think in terms of the I think that I worry after the 18th, after Morocco wins, about how this issue of migrant labor in that region will just disappear. There's been so much focus on this for 10 years. It's been problematic focus, but there has been a focus. And so what will happen when the cameras go away and we move to the next thing? So I think, the only way to keep this issue alive is to think about the kind of question transnationally, and for the activists, both there from the sending countries and here doing that work, to think much more transnationally and strategize more transnationally. And that's very difficult to do.
Splitting up, do you want to do one of the questions and then Alzette can take more of the
Yeah,
colonizing
absolutely.
journalism?
We'll just go down that.
Yeah.
Um,
One by one.
On the question of what happens after Morocco wins, which I will be perfectly happy with that, just as long as France doesn't win.
I think we can all agree.
I hazard a guess that it's going to end up being a lot about, oh, look how these as you know, a large number of the Moroccan players were born outside of Morocco, and their families are part of the North African diaspora working class in Europe. So I think a lot of them, unfortunately, there'll be these articles about, look, it's when we give them good training and schooling, and this is basically a European team, and we look. This is I'm sure you're going to get this very colonial kind of our takes on it. I suspect there's already been a few of that. It's like, oh, this is an exceptional team. It's not really a Moroccan team. But to go back to the Palestine issue, one thing that's for me striking is, yes, if 70% of this team were born outside of Morocco, they're the ones who chose to have the Palestinian flag. So these are Moroccans who from Belgium and France and these sorts of things. That's one striking. On the 2030 bid, it is interesting. If you do recall when FIFA wanted to have a quote unquote African World Cup, and they ultimately, through incredibly corrupt ways, ended up giving it to South Africa, Morocco, by all accounts, had the best bid at that point for 2010. It didn't obviously wasn't successful. FIFA just presents itself. It uses, actually, to go back to Ali's comment, FIFA likes to really present itself as like, oh, we're decentering the West, and we're decentering Europe, and look, we're giving the World Cup in the Arab world, we're giving the World Cup in South Africa, we gave a World Cup to Korea and Japan. So they actually very much push this agenda that we are an organization of the global South.
They're decolonial.
Yes, but it's all multimillionaires doing all this. But anyway, so they're comfortable with this. I find it. Look, I never thought there would be a World Cup in Qatar. I never thought there would be a World Cup with Mexico, US, and Canada. That's crazy. In the midst of you know, with this climate change, they're gonna have a World Cup where people are gonna be shuttling across a whole continent, right? Deeply problematic. I mean, so having a World Cup with Saudi, yeah, these things are very. I don't have much to say, but and this is very dark and shady stuff. Right? I mean, if I can give you something, just FIFA is an incredibly corrupt organization. It has been for decades, and if you want to study the World Cup, yes, study Qatar and these wherever South Africa. But just remember, this is all is organized and managed by an organization. And if you study the US government, you study the Iranian government, you can study FIFA as an organization and the politics of FIFA. And that's fascinating stuff. You may just be careful doing it. But I think that's one way to understand that these international organizations are not neutral. Understand.
Basically, at the end, I get the very easy question about decolonizing journalism. I mean, the professional answer is that you decolonize journalism by bringing more diversity into journalism, which is what we're trying to do here at NYU and what every J school tries to do, because the idea essentially is that journalism reflects who's producing it. And so when you have more diverse newsrooms that reflect society, then news reflects the complexities and the grievances and the realities of that society. And it does, even at the margins, make a big difference. I've just come from the UK after living and working there in the media for many years. And the UK media is significantly less diverse than the US media. And I think that that's really reflected in the coverage on, especially on minority communities, racial communities, migration, sort of these questions of rural-urban divides and electorates. For example, sort of diversity figures in the US are something like 8 to 9% of journalists come from ethnic or racial minority background. In the UK, it's 3 to 4%. So, I mean, that's the conventional answer. It's either structurally you change who goes into journalism. I don't know if, I mean, we will do that, but also at the same time, institutional media, legacy media is very resistant to change and will tend to reflect status quo political interests of the powers of the day. So on the other hand, you know, we have all had careers watching a lot of that change, and you know, and the way that it seeps into changing actual coverage, the change politics of coverage is very slow. So that's my sort of professional answer to it. But then we have the internet, and you have social media, and you have a whole widened sphere of journalism that exists outside of legacy media and institutional media. And when it reflects reality better or more completely or more vividly, that's incredibly powerful. And it sort of holds those institutions to account in ways that 20 years ago, 25 years ago, when we started our careers, that didn't happen. So I think that's tremendously exciting, and it's a sort of disruptor. And it changes the sort of the political economies of ownership, which of course also shape editorial content. So that's, you know, I think something that was really highlighted in our discussion is that when there are moments when you have, you know, the eyes of the world and many people's cameras and social media and different platforms on something extraordinary that's unfolding, much of those complexities and nuances that we want institutional media to reflect come out anyway in different forms of journalism. So I think, you know, we will continue to strive in the ways that we do to change how to do that within the structures of the institutions and within academic institutions that are training the future of journalists. But also we have this whole other horizon that's sort of helping that along.
Thank you, and I'll add, Leila, you might already be a member of AMEJA, but if you're not, join AMEJA. That's a small step toward decolonizing journalism, here at least. And on that note, I thank you all. Thanks AMEJA for co-sponsoring this with us. Please, we have a reception. Thank you. Also have some alcohol, unlike Keystone. So please,